The dull, heavy thud of the black industrial trash bag hitting my imported silk rug was the loudest sound in the great room. For a fraction of a second, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased. Then my father-in-law Charles threw his head back and let out a booming, theatrical laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of his rented Annapolis estate. "There you go, sweetheart," Charles announced, gesturing grandly to the crinkled plastic heap resting near my heels. "A little something for the dump you call a home." Around the perimeter of the sprawling living room, the extended family joined the chorus of manufactured amusement. 5 years I had spent navigating this exact ritual. 5 years of performing the dutiful, submissive daughter-in-law role, absorbing their thinly veiled insults wrapped in the guise of holiday cheer. Diet pills, bargain bin cleaning supplies, self-help paperbacks on how to be a better wife. Each December brought a new variation of the same cruel joke, always met with my polite, forced smile and my husband Derek complacently chuckling along. I glanced sideways at Derek. He swirled the amber liquid in his highball glass, a smirk playing on his lips, entirely unwilling to defend the woman he married. Across the velvet sectional, my mother-in-law Victoria let out a dramatic, breathy sigh. She adjusted the cuff of her cashmere cardigan and deliberately tapped the face of her $30,000 diamond-encrusted Rolex. The pristine timepiece caught the light of the 12-foot Douglas fir glittering with a cold brilliance. "Can we expedite this?" Charles Victoria murmured, rubbing her temples as if the mere act of sharing airspace with me drained her life force. "The evening is dragging, and her presence is just so taxing." That Rolex. She wore it like a crown, a glaring symbol of a dynasty built on hollow foundations. I noted the ticking second hand, committing the image to memory, acutely aware that the watch would soon serve a much higher, far more poetic purpose. I did not cry. I did not shrink into the upholstery. I experienced a sudden, profound quiet settling over my mind. A psychological tether snapped. The desperate, exhausting need to earn their approval evaporated, replaced by the chilling clarity of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a snare. I just smiled, reached into my structured leather handbag, and retrieved a small, unassuming velvet box. They thought they had finally broken my spirit. They had no idea that inside that small box was the ignition switch for their total financial ruin. Before I tell you how I dismantled their hollow dynasty, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Told Stories if you believe toxic relatives always get exactly what they deserve. The contrast was stark, a cheap garbage bag pooling at my feet and a flawless midnight blue container resting in my palm. I stepped forward and placed the box softly onto the center of the glass-topped coffee table. I pushed it forward with a single manicured finger until it stopped inches from Charles. "Merry Christmas, Charles," I said. My voice was steady, pitched low, stripped of any warmth or deference. "I got you something too, but there is a rule." Charles stared at the box, his thick eyebrows knitting together in suspicion. The laughter in the room vanished, replaced by a tense, palpable curiosity. "Open it," I instructed, holding his gaze with unblinking focus, "and read the note taped to the inside of the lid out loud." The room fell into a mocking hush. Every single pair of eyes in that vaulted waterfront living room shifted from the plastic garbage sack at my feet to the velvet box resting on the glass coffee table. The air felt thick, smelling of roasted pine and catered appetizers. My father-in-law, Charles, scoffed. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, a garment purchased with money he did not actually possess. He reached down and picked up the small container, treating it as though it were a diseased object. He yanked the silk ribbon. The satisfying tear of the fabric echoed sharply in the silent space, cutting through the soft holiday music playing from the hidden speakers. He lifted the lid with a theatrical sigh, clearly preparing his next biting insult to entertain the gathered crowd. I stood perfectly still, watching his eyes track across the first line of the certified document folded neatly inside. His smug grin vanished. It did not just fade, it was erased. The robust flush of color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly translucent hue. His jaw dropped. His chest stopped moving. He was staring at the original notarized property deed to the sprawling Annapolis estate we were currently standing in. The Williams family loved to project an image of untouchable generational wealth. They hosted catered dinners, charity auctions, and lavish holiday gatherings in this magnificent home. They spent years boasting to the Maryland high society about their brilliant real estate investments and impeccable taste. But I knew the ugly truth hiding behind the marble columns and crystal chandeliers. A vivid memory surfaced, pushing aside the scent of cedar and Victoria's cloying designer perfume. Just 3 weeks prior, I sat in a dimly lit diner across town. Sitting opposite me was a man named Arthur Henderson, the actual owner of the estate. Arthur looked exhausted. He rubbed his temples while sliding a thick financial ledger across the sticky table. He smelled of stale coffee and profound desperation. He confessed that Charles was 6 months behind on his lease payments, totaling over $90,000 in arrears. The great patriarch of the Williams family was bouncing checks and dodging phone calls, all while continuing to host extravagant parties to maintain his fake socialite status. Arthur was facing imminent foreclosure because of my father-in-law. He knew I held a lucrative position as a senior director of federal compliance, and he pleaded with me to intervene before the bank seized the property. My career required meticulous financial auditing and risk assessment. I understood exactly how to execute complex fiscal maneuvers. Instead of bailing Charles out, I formed a private holding company. I purchased the estate directly from Arthur, paying in cash and closing the deal quietly under a corporate veil. Now Charles stared at the heavy cream-colored paper, trembling. His hands shook so severely the document rattled loudly against the cardboard box. His eyes darted from the gold foil seal to my face, searching for any sign of a joke. He looked at the signature line, verifying the transfer of ownership. "Read it, Charles," I prompted, my voice slicing through the suffocating tension. "Read the name of the new property owner out loud for your guests." He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, but he remained entirely mute. The man who had just roared with laughter over a garbage bag could not form a single syllable. I turned my head slowly, addressing the crowd of gaping relatives and elite friends gathered around the fireplace. I maintained a cool, clinical posture, refusing to let any emotion show. I casually informed the room that Mr. Henderson sold the property to a private entity 2 weeks ago. I watched the realization dawn on their faces. The woman they had just handed a trash bag actually owned the roof over their heads. The arrogant reality they had carefully constructed over the past decade shattered into invisible pieces. I told them the lease was officially under my control. Beside the roaring fireplace, Victoria gasped. Her perfectly manicured fingers went limp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and plummeted toward the hardwood floor. The shattering glass sounded like a gunshot. The expensive sparkling wine seeped into the grout lines, creating a stark visual of their ruined facade. She stared at me, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her entire social standing was resting in the palm of my hand. The aunts and uncles exchanged panic whispers, their mocking smiles replaced by genuine fear. They looked around the opulent room, suddenly aware that none of the art on the walls or the rugs on the floor belonged to the people hosting them. The sweet taste of victory washed over me, but the triumph was suddenly interrupted. A harsh grip clamped down on my bicep. Derek, my husband of 4 years, stood beside me, his face twisted in furious disbelief. The charming, complacent persona he wore all evening melted away, revealing a stranger with dark, narrowed eyes. "We need to talk, right now," Derek hissed. He did not wait for my response. He yanked my arm, dragging me away from the stunned audience. He pulled me out of the grand living room and down the dim corridor leading toward the guest quarters. The sudden physical shift caught me off guard, but I quickly regained my footing. He shoved me into the hallway and cornered me against the textured wallpaper. His breath smelled of scotch and rising panic. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "Where did you get the money for this?" Derek demanded, his voice a venomous, frantic whisper. "How could you humiliate my parents like that, in front of everyone? You made them look like fools." I straightened my posture, brushing his hand off my arm with practiced disdain. I looked at the man I married, feeling the last remnants of my affection evaporate into the cold hallway air. I told him his parents did a fine job making themselves look like fools when they handed me a trash bag. I reminded him that I worked tirelessly for my career in biodefense, while he spent his days managing a vague consulting firm that never seemed to generate actual revenue. I refused to apologize for securing an asset when his father was running a financial charade. Derek stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "This is not a game, Amanda," he growled. "That house is the foundation of their business image. You are going to transfer that deed into my name tomorrow morning. We are married, which means that property belongs to both of us. You will not disrespect my family this way." I stared at him, realizing the depth of his entitlement. He honestly believed he could demand the fruits of my labor to shield his parents from their own failures. He wanted to claim ownership of a multi-million-dollar estate he did not contribute a single penny toward. He tried to gaslight me, insisting that my individual success was somehow a joint marital asset designed to fund his parents' extravagant lifestyle. The marital conflict erupted rapidly, transforming from a hushed argument into an irreversible battle line. I knew right then that the man standing in front of me was not a partner. He was a parasite. I stepped past him, heading toward the front door, leaving him fuming in the hallway. I realized that evicting my in-laws was only the first step. I needed to investigate my own husband. The drive back to our townhouse was a suffocating war zone. The plush leather interior of my luxury sedan felt like a pressurized cabin moments before structural failure. Derek gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, steering us down the desolate stretch of Route 50 toward Annapolis. The rhythmic flash of the Maryland highway streetlights cut through the dark interior. Every passing overhead bulb cast a harsh yellow glare, illuminating the frantic sweat accumulating on his forehead. The charming, complacent persona he wore at the Christmas party had evaporated entirely. Stripped of his manufactured superiority, my husband was unraveling at a terrifying speed. He drove dangerously fast, the engine roaring in protest against the freezing winter air outside. His jaw clenched and unclenched as he tried to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers. He demanded I immediately add his name to the newly acquired deed. He raised his voice, insisting the Annapolis estate was marital property and that I had no right to humiliate his family. He claimed I was legally obligated to share the asset because we built our lives together. I sat in the passenger seat staring straight ahead at the dark road. I refused his demand with a calm, steady tone that only seemed to infuriate him further. I reminded him that I purchased the property using a private inheritance left to me by my late grandfather. As a senior director of federal compliance, dealing with highly classified defense contractors, my financial background is subject to rigorous government audits. Shielding my assets is second nature. I reminded Derek about the ironclad prenuptial agreement we signed 4 years ago. The contract distinctly isolated all familial inheritance, shielding it from any joint marital claims. He knew this. He signed the paperwork in a sprawling law office long before we ever exchanged vows. Enraged by the impenetrable legal wall I placed between him and the estate, Derek slipped up. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel and screamed that his parents needed that specific house for their consulting image. The phrase hung in the dry, heated air of the car. Consulting image. The words echoed in my mind, triggering a sharp analytical reflex. What kind of boutique consulting firm required a multi-million-dollar waterfront estate they could not actually afford? Real wealth does not need to rent a stage. My suspicion grew, rapidly mutating into a cold, calculating focus. Sitting quietly in the passenger seat, I pulled my smartphone from my designer purse. The screen cast a pale blue glow over my face. I bypassed our standard banking applications and accessed my encrypted credit monitoring dashboard. I utilized a dual-factor authentication protocol designed specifically for federal employees. I expected to find a few drained checking accounts or perhaps a maxed-out credit card used to fund his parents' extravagant holiday gifts. The data populating the screen made my stomach drop. I uncovered something far, far worse than petty theft. It was sophisticated financial identity theft. I scrolled through the hidden ledgers, watching the numerical proof of my husband's betrayal unfold in real time. Derek had leveraged my flawless federal credit score. He secured extensive shadow loans against a joint investment portfolio we established during our first year of marriage. He forged my digital signature, authorizing staggering capital withdrawals. He funneled the stolen funds directly into offshore holding accounts linked to his parents' business. They were staggering frauds living off my stolen financial identity. Every designer suit Charles wore, every catered dinner Victoria hosted, and every supposed business trip Derek took was funded by my hard-earned money. They treated me like a disposable peasant while literally surviving on the capital they secretly drained from my name. The sheer scale of the deception took my breath away. My own husband had orchestrated a multi-year scheme to siphon my wealth, all while laughing at my expense during family gatherings. I read the routing numbers and the withdrawn amounts out loud. My voice was devoid of emotion, sounding more like a forensic auditor reading a verdict than a heartbroken wife. The car swerved slightly as Derek realized what I was looking at. The color drained from his face, matching the panicked sweat on his brow. He tried to stammer out a justification. He claimed it was just a temporary bridge loan for his father. He swore they were going to pay it back with interest once a lucrative government contract cleared. He begged me to understand that maintaining the Williams family reputation was vital for their ongoing business negotiations. I did not care about his pathetic excuses. I ordered him to pull the vehicle over immediately. We were miles away from the city limits, surrounded by nothing but frozen fields and dark trees. The Chesapeake Bay wind howled outside the thick glass windows. He refused to stop gripping the wheel tighter and insisting we needed to go home and discuss this like rational adults. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stated very clearly that the car was registered solely in my name. I promised him that if he did not stop the engine right this second, I would dial the state troopers and report him for grand theft auto. Derek slammed his foot on the brake pedal. The tires screeched harshly against the icy asphalt, sending a shudder through the chassis as the sedan skidded onto the gravel shoulder. The vehicle lurched to a halt. Dust and loose winter debris kicked up into the cold night air. "Get out," I commanded, pointing a steady finger toward his door. He stared at me, his eyes wide with genuine shock. He could not fathom that the submissive woman he had manipulated for years was capable of leaving him stranded on a dark, freezing highway. He argued that it was 20 degrees outside and his phone battery was nearly dead. He tried to reach across the console to grab my hand, deploying a desperate, fabricated look of remorse. I slapped his hand away with swift precision. I told him he could use his pristine consulting image to flag down a passing truck. Seeing the unyielding ice in my expression, Derek finally opened his door. The freezing December wind whipped through the open cabin, instantly dropping the temperature. He stepped out onto the gravel, shivering in his expensive tailored tuxedo. I slid across the center console and took the driver's seat. I did not offer a single parting word. I pulled the door shut, locking it with a sharp, definitive click. I shifted the car into drive and merged back onto the empty highway, leaving my treacherous husband fading into the darkness of the rear-view mirror. I drove alone, the silence of the cabin providing a stark contrast to the chaotic betrayal I had just unearthed. My mind raced, categorizing the financial data, preparing to freeze every compromised account the moment I reached my home office. Just as the city lights of Annapolis appeared on the horizon, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a secure notification tone reserved exclusively for my corporate biodefense server. I glanced at the glowing screen. A red flag alert displayed a strange anomaly in a Department of Defense logistics contract associated with a third-party vendor. The timing was entirely too perfect. The forensic auditor inside me recognized the pattern immediately. The true war had just begun. The morning sun crested over the Chesapeake Bay, casting a blinding, fractured glare across my office windows. I sat at my mahogany desk inside the secure wing of the biodefense firm, clutching a ceramic mug of black coffee. My eyes burned from a lack of sleep, but my mind operated with razor-sharp clarity. As the senior director of federal compliance, my entire career revolved around hunting down financial discrepancies. I protected billions of dollars in government grants from internal fraud and external threats. I possessed a clearance level that required pristine integrity. My in-laws knew this. They understood that any blemish on my professional reputation could trigger a federal review and subsequently destroy my livelihood. The sharp, shrill ring of my secure desk phone sliced through the quiet hum of the office. I glanced at the caller ID. The display read, Executive Suite. It was Stephen, the Vice President of Operations. The sound of that specific ringtone set my teeth on edge. Stephen rarely bypassed the internal messaging system unless a situation required immediate classified attention. I picked up the receiver, keeping my tone neutral. Stephen asked me to come up to his office right away. He sounded incredibly tense. I walked down the glass-lined corridor, my mind racing through a dozen different scenarios. Did Derek try to intercept my corporate accounts? Did the Department of Defense anomaly from last night trigger a lockdown? I stepped into Stephen's sprawling corner office. He stood by the window staring out at the Maryland skyline, holding a digital audio recorder. Stephen was a veteran of the defense industry, a man who valued loyalty and precision above all else. 2 years ago, I had intercepted a corrupted vendor contract that would have cost the firm a staggering sum and a congressional inquiry. I saved his career, and in return, he trusted my judgment implicitly. "Take a seat," Amanda Stevens said, turning around. He placed the recorder on the polished surface of his desk. "Someone called my private extension this morning. She bypassed the receptionist by claiming to be a prominent Annapolis socialite with urgent, highly sensitive information regarding national security." Stephen pressed a button. The room filled with the unmistakable breathy cadence of my mother-in-law. Victoria was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her voice trembled with artificial grief, weaving a hysterical, fabricated narrative. She told Stephen that she was calling out of profound maternal concern. She claimed I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown, insisting that my behavior had become erratic and dangerous. Then she dropped the ultimate poison pill. Victoria stated on a recorded corporate line that I was actively embezzling company funds to purchase luxury real estate behind my husband's back. She urged Stephen to terminate my employment immediately and freeze my security clearance before I caused the company irreparable harm. The recording clicked off. A heavy silence settled between us. I looked at Stephen. I did not attempt to defend myself. I did not cry or express outrage. I simply met his gaze with unyielding calm. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He knew my financial records were audited quarterly by the Pentagon. He knew an embezzlement charge was logically impossible, given the architecture of our secure servers. "I assume this is the woman whose husband currently resides in the property you just purchased through your private LLC," Stephen noted, a dry, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. I nodded, confirming his suspicion. Stephen slid the audio recorder across the desk until it rested in front of me. He informed me that corporate security had traced the call directly to Victoria's registered cell phone. Instead of getting me fired, my mother-in-law had blindly handed me a recorded, irrefutable confession of corporate defamation and tortious interference. It was a digital weapon I could deploy to ruin her entire social standing and drain whatever remaining funds she possessed in civil court. I thanked Stephen for his unwavering trust. I took the recorder, walked back to my office, and shifted from defense to offense. Victoria wanted to play a game of public humiliation. I was going to show her what a flawless execution actually looked like. I opened my legal drafting software. I did not waste time with warnings or polite requests. I drafted a formal, uncompromising 30-day eviction notice for the Annapolis estate. I cited the exact statutes of Maryland property law, ensuring the document was legally bulletproof. I printed the notice on heavy, stark white cardstock. The black ink looked like a death sentence for their fake dynasty. Next, I contacted a specialized private process server known for handling high-profile clients in the capital region. I paid a premium for a highly specific delivery method. I knew exactly where Charles and Victoria were spending their afternoon. Every Tuesday, without fail, they attended an exclusive luncheon at the most prestigious country club in the county. It was a gathering of defense contractors, local politicians, and wealthy heirs. It was the epicenter of their fabricated universe. I instructed the server to dress in a tailored suit, blend in with the elite guests, and execute the delivery right in the middle of the main dining room during the peak lunch hour. At 1:15 in the afternoon, my cell phone vibrated. It was a text from the process server confirming the drop. He included a brief, highly satisfying description of the event. He had approached their table just as the waiter poured the champagne. He announced Charles and Victoria by their full legal names, ensuring the surrounding tables fell silent. He dropped the heavy eviction notice right onto Victoria's plate of seared scallops. The server reported that the color vanished from Victoria's face, while Charles sputtered, attempting to hide the bold lettering from the prying eyes of a state senator sitting at the adjacent booth. The pristine country club atmosphere shattered. The whispers began immediately. In a world where reputation is currency, they were just publicly declared bankrupt. They were exposed as tenants being thrown out into the street. A profound wave of vindication washed over me. I spent the rest of the afternoon auditing the suspicious Department of Defense logistics contract, my focus sharpened by the victory. The work consumed me until the sky outside turned a deep, bruised purple. I packed my briefcase and drove back to my quiet, secure townhouse. The house felt lighter without Derek's presence. I poured a glass of red wine, savoring the silence. Just as I sat down on the sofa, the screen of my phone lit up with a rapid succession of hostile text messages. The sender was Brooke, my sister-in-law. Brooke was 28 years old, a woman who had never worked a legitimate day in her life, surviving entirely on the fraudulent allowance her father provided. She was the golden child, deeply entrenched in the illusion of their generational wealth. Her messages were frantic, dripping with venom and unchecked panic. She called me a vindictive, calculating monster. She screamed through the digital text that I had ruined her parents' reputation and humiliated them in front of the most important people in the state. But it was the final message that made me pause the wine glass hovering inches from my lips. Brooke gloated, her tone shifting from hysterical anger to supreme arrogance. She warned me that my little eviction stunt was a pathetic failure. She proudly declared that Charles had already retained a team of ruthless corporate litigators. According to Brooke, they were filing an emergency legal motion tomorrow morning to seize the Annapolis property through a hidden shadow trust, claiming my purchase was an illegal transaction. I stared at the glowing screen, the wine turning sour on my tongue. Charles was not retreating. He was escalating. He was deploying stolen funds to buy a corrupt legal victory. The battlefield was shifting from the country club to the courtroom, and I needed to uncover exactly how he planned to execute this new treacherous maneuver. The scraping sound of thick paper sliding against hard wood broke the pre-dawn silence of my townhouse. I stood near the kitchen island holding a fresh cup of coffee, listening to the distinct shuffle of footsteps retreating down my front walkway. I set the mug down and walked toward the foyer. A heavy manila envelope rested on the floor just beneath the mail slot. The coarse yellow paper looked innocuous, but my pulse quickened with the instinct of a seasoned auditor recognizing a threat. I knelt and picked it up, feeling the substantial weight of the documents hidden inside. There was no return address. I tore the flap open and pulled out a thick stack of legal filings bound by a blue cover sheet. The seal of the local circuit court glared back at me. It was an emergency injunction, a temporary restraining order, halting the 30-day eviction notice I had served to my in-laws. I scanned the first page, noting the presiding magistrate, Judge Alden Prescott. The name triggered a sharp recollection. During my first year of marriage, I attended a lavish fundraising dinner at the Annapolis estate. Charles stood at the head of the banquet table, boasting about raising 6 figures for Judge Prescott's re-election campaign. Charles was cashing in his political chips, leveraging the corrupt underbelly of Maryland local politics to protect his stolen lifestyle. The injunction granted Charles and Victoria immediate protection against removal, claiming my purchase of the property was an illicit transaction that bypassed a pre-existing family trust. I flipped through the pages, dissecting the dense legal jargon with practiced efficiency. The entire premise of their lawsuit rested on a single piece of supposedly ironclad evidence listed as Exhibit A. I turned to the back of the packet and stared at the appended document. The breath caught in my throat. It was a general power of attorney form granting Derek unilateral control over my real estate assets. On the bottom line, sitting stark and undeniable against the white paper, was my signature. Except I never signed it. The loops were too wide, the pressure too heavy. It was a flawless imitation of my handwriting, executed by someone who had spent 4 years watching me sign checks and legal forms. Derek forged my name. Just below the fraudulent signature sat a raised embosser seal and a blue ink stamp from a licensed Maryland notary public. The name on the stamp belonged to the senior paralegal at Charles's lobbying firm. They had orchestrated this crime together. Charles provided the corrupt notary to legitimize the document, while Derek committed the actual forgery. A profound, chilling shift occurred within my chest. Up until this exact second, a tiny fractured part of my mind still viewed Derek as a weak, misguided husband acting under the thumb of his domineering parents. That illusion evaporated instantly. Derek was no longer a disappointing spouse. He was a federal felon. The man I shared a bed with had knowingly conspired to strip me of my inheritance, orchestrate a fraudulent legal takeover, and drive me into financial ruin. The final thread of my empathy dissolved, leaving behind an icy, relentless resolve. I decided in that quiet foyer that simply kicking them out of my house was no longer sufficient. I was going to dismantle their entire existence, brick by brick. I walked into my home office and locked the door behind me. I booted up my encrypted workstation, the dual monitors flaring to life with a sterile white glow. If Charles could afford to retain a top-tier litigation firm to draft this fraudulent injunction, he was paying them with liquid cash. I knew he was 6 months behind on his rent, and Derek had drained our joint accounts. So where was the retainer money coming from? I logged into my biodefense company's secure server and initiated a localized open-source intelligence sweep. As a compliance director, I utilized OSINT software daily to vet third-party defense contractors and trace murky corporate ownership structures. The tools were designed to unearth hidden assets, shell companies, and overlapping board memberships. I typed Charles's full legal name and the primary tax identification number for his boutique lobbying firm into the search parameters. The algorithm began to chew through public records, property deeds, tax filings, and campaign finance disclosures. Lines of code cascaded down my left monitor, forming a complex digital web of Charles's financial history. For the first 10 minutes, the results matched my expectations. Over-leveraged credit lines, maxed-out business loans, and a string of civil judgments for unpaid vendor invoices. Charles was operating a hollow shell, projecting wealth while drowning in debt. Then, the software hit a snag. The progress bar froze. A blinking red prompt appeared on the screen, indicating an encrypted barrier. The search protocol had traced a recent wire transfer sent from Charles's firm to the litigation attorneys who filed the injunction. The algorithm attempted to trace the origin of those funds backward to the source account. Instead of pulling up a standard domestic commercial bank, the trace slammed into a sophisticated digital firewall. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the network routing protocols bouncing back from the barrier. The firewall was shielding a series of offshore holding accounts. This level of financial obfuscation was incredibly expensive and highly unusual for a local political lobbyist. It was the exact type of cloaking mechanism I routinely saw deployed by hostile foreign entities attempting to mask their ownership of domestic shell companies. I engaged a deeper forensic tracing tool, deploying a packet-sniffing script to analyze the digital breadcrumbs surrounding the firewall. The screen flickered as the script bypassed the initial security layer and extracted a fragmented list of offshore routing destinations. The destination codes were unmistakable. The money funding Charles's legal assault against me originated from a highly protected banking institution in the Cayman Islands. My pulse drummed a steady, rapid rhythm against my collarbone. A broke lobbyist from Annapolis does not maintain heavily encrypted Cayman Island accounts unless he is laundering illicit funds. The petty real estate dispute over a rented mansion was merely a symptom of a much deeper rot. Charles and Derek were not just stealing from me to maintain their country club image. They were funneling vast sums of dark money across international borders. I realized that the strange anomaly I had spotted in the Department of Defense logistics contract the night before was not a coincidence. Derek's consulting firm shared a financial pipeline with Charles's lobbying enterprise. They were woven together in a labyrinth of federal defense grants and offshore tax havens. They believed they were cornering a helpless daughter-in-law using a forged legal document to steal her house. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they had just handed the map of their hidden criminal empire to a woman whose sole profession was destroying financial predators. I saved the trace logs to a secure, encrypted flash drive. The digital evidence of their fraud was mounting, but I needed more time to crack the Cayman firewall and expose the true source of their wealth. I needed them to feel confident. I needed them to believe their fake injunction was working perfectly so they would drop their guard. Just as I removed the flash drive from the port, my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. A notification popped up on the screen. It was an automated alert from my secondary credit card provider, informing me that a routine transaction at a local coffee shop had been declined due to insufficient funds. The notification was followed immediately by a venomous text message from my sister-in-law, Brooke. The psychological warfare was expanding from the courtroom into the public square, and I needed to play the perfect victim to keep them distracted from the storm I was building in the shadows. The morning after discovering the forged injunction, I sat at a corner table inside a high-end Annapolis coffee shop. My encrypted laptop rested on the reclaimed wood surface, running complex decryption algorithms in the background. The scent of roasted espresso and warm pastries usually brought a sense of calm, but today my focus was sharp, rigid, and unyielding. I needed caffeine to sustain the upcoming battle. Brooke was escalating the psychological warfare, and I had to remain entirely grounded. I approached the counter, ordering a simple black coffee. I retrieved my Platinum credit card from my wallet and tapped the chip against the digital terminal. A sharp, obnoxious beep echoed from the machine. The screen flashed a harsh red warning indicating a declined transaction. The young barista offered a sympathetic grimace, quietly suggesting I try inserting the chip instead. I complied. The same red warning flashed again. A line of wealthy patrons was forming behind me, their impatient sighs rustling through the quiet cafe. I smiled politely, handed the barista a crisp $20 bill, and returned to my corner table. I did not panic. As a forensic auditor, I knew exactly what a sudden financial blockage meant. I opened my banking application on my smartphone. The joint operational checking account I shared with Derek, which held our monthly liquid capital, displayed a balance of 0. Derek had drained the remaining funds right down to the last cent. I traced the routing history directly from my phone. The capital had not gone to a grocery store or a utility company. It was wired to a boutique public relations agency located in downtown Annapolis. My husband was funding his sister's smear campaign using my paycheck. Brooke Williams treated high society gossip like a competitive sport. She was 28 years old, possessing no actual career, and surviving solely on the fraudulent allowance her father provided. Her entire identity hinged on being a prominent member of the Maryland elite. Since Charles and Victoria were currently battling my eviction notice, Brooke took it upon herself to execute the psychological warfare. She was highly effective. By noon that same day, I began to feel the chilling effects of her coordinated assault. I received a calendar notification that a weekly lunch meeting with the wife of a prominent defense contractor had been abruptly canceled without explanation. My emails to local charity board members went unanswered. Brooke was systematically contacting the wives of aerospace executives and biotech leaders, weaving a narrative that I was a calculating gold digger. She spread vicious rumors that my greed had driven Derek to a nervous breakdown and that I was currently attempting to steal the Williams family legacy. She was isolating me, turning the tight-knit defense community against me to force my surrender. The true test of her poison occurred that evening. My firm required executive attendance at the annual Chesapeake Bay Conservancy silent auction. It was a mandatory networking event held at a waterfront pavilion packed with the exact demographic Brooke was actively targeting. I arrived wearing a tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of untouchable professionalism. I navigated the room, bidding on quiet auction items, maintaining my poise. I felt the cold stares. I noticed groups of women abruptly changing their conversations as I approached. Brooke had done her work well. Halfway through the evening, Brooke cornered me near the grand staircase. She held a martini glass, her posture radiating unearned triumph. She did not bother lowering her voice. In fact, she deliberately projected her words, ensuring the surrounding defense contractors could hear every single insult. Brooke smirked, asking how I planned to pay for my auction bids when my platinum cards were bouncing at local coffee shops. She laughed, a grating shrill sound, claiming the entire city knew I was broke. She promised that the Williams family would leave me destitute, sleeping in the gutter by the end of the month. The surrounding guests paused their conversations, turning their heads to watch the confrontation. They expected me to snap to cry or to flee the pavilion in shame. I stood perfectly still. I let her harsh words hang in the silent air. I did not defend my finances or hurl insults in return. I simply looked at her with the cold, analytical gaze of an auditor examining a severe liability. I maintained a terrifying silence, absorbing her mockery without a single flinch. The lack of reaction unnerved her, causing her smug grin to falter just a fraction. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing awkwardly on the staircase. I exited the pavilion and stepped into the freezing night air. The winter wind whipped off the bay, but I felt nothing but a rising tactical thrill. Brooke wanted to play psychological games, so I decided to hand them a masterpiece. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and pulled out my phone. I needed them to become sloppy. I needed them to believe their smear campaign and their forged injunction had successfully broken my spirit. I opened my text thread with Derek and typed a frantic, desperate message. "Derek, please make it stop," I wrote, pouring fake terror into the digital text. "I cannot fight this legal battle anymore. My cards are bouncing and my reputation is ruined. Tell your father I will drop the eviction. I will sign whatever he wants. Just tell Brooke to call off her friends. I am terrified." I hit send. It was a brilliant diversion, a classic red herring designed to feed their insatiable narcissism. I watched the read receipt illuminate almost instantly. I could picture Derek showing the screen to Charles, the two of them celebrating their supposed victory, popping expensive champagne purchased with stolen funds. They would drop their guard, they would assume the war was over, and in their arrogance they would stop monitoring their own digital footprint. While they celebrated my fake surrender, I drove home and executed my true strategy. I walked into my secure home office and finalized the transfer of my primary wealth. The inheritance, the liquid capital I had hidden away, and the overarching ownership of the Annapolis estate were quietly shifted into an untraceable ghost LLC. The corporate veil was impenetrable, shielding my assets from any future retaliatory litigation Charles might attempt. I watched the confirmation screen flash green, locking my financial independence behind a wall of encrypted legal protection. Just as the transfer cleared, a secondary monitor on my desk chimed with a piercing digital tone. The open-source intelligence algorithm I had deployed against Charles's lobbying firm earlier that morning had been running continuously, chipping away at the Cayman Island firewall. My red herring had worked perfectly. Believing they had won, Charles or someone in his corrupt network had logged into the offshore account to check their balances, momentarily opening a tiny, unprotected port in their server architecture. The algorithm seized the opening. The encrypted firewall shattered. A sprawling payload of devastating data began downloading directly onto my localized server. The progress bar raced across the screen, dropping thousands of financial ledgers, email transcripts, and wire transfer receipts into my secure drive. I opened the first decrypted folder, leaning close to the glowing monitor. The numbers and routing codes painted a terrifying picture. The conflict was about to shift from a petty real estate dispute into a realm of unprecedented criminal severity. The cool air of my home office carried the faint metallic scent of running servers. Two curved monitors illuminated the dark room, casting a stark white glare across my face. I sat upright in my ergonomic chair, staring at the sprawling digital payload my algorithm had just extracted from the offshore firewall. Thousands of decrypted financial ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and hidden email chains cascaded down the screens. My eyes tracked the numerical patterns, mapping the illicit flow of currency with practiced ease. As a compliance director, I did not see random digits. I saw a story written in raw, unvarnished truth. People lie effortlessly, displaying fake smiles at country club luncheons, but accounting ledgers never fabricate a narrative. The math always reveals the true nature of the beast. I opened the primary Cayman Islands folder, leaning closer to the glowing display. Row after row of structured deposits materialized, tracking backwards over the span of 3 years. The capital flowing into these hidden accounts was staggering. The deposits did not align with the standard revenue of a boutique Maryland political lobbyist. Charles projected the image of a seasoned political operator shaking hands at Annapolis charity galas and hosting lavish dinners, yet his declared domestic income barely covered his luxury car leases. The real wealth, the capital sustaining his pristine country club facade, originated from these hidden tropical servers. He was moving millions of dollars under the radar, hiding behind shell corporations and anonymous holding trusts. I highlighted a recurring routing number originating from a dummy corporation established in Grand Cayman. The string of digits felt strangely familiar, pulling at the meticulous catalog of data stored in my memory. I split the screen, opening the secure portal to my biodefense firm network. I recalled the strange alert that buzzed on my phone during the freezing highway drive after I abandoned Derek. It was a flagged anomaly within a Department of Defense logistics contract, a tiny discrepancy in a billing code that I had flagged for further review. I typed the Cayman routing sequence into my corporate vendor database and initiated a cross-reference protocol. The progress bar crawled across the screen. My pulse beat a slow, steady rhythm against my collarbone. The cooling fans of my computer whirred louder, processing the vast amount of data. The system chimed a sharp, definitive note, cutting through the quiet office. The screen flashed a perfect match. The offshore holding company Charles used to hide his wealth shared the exact same banking credentials as a third-party subcontractor currently embedded in my firm federal supply chain. The sheer gravity of the discovery anchored me to my chair. Charles was not merely a fake socialite clinging to a rented mansion. He was the architect of a sprawling federal conspiracy. I expanded the subcontractor file, piecing the puzzle together with forensic precision. Derek operated a vague consulting firm. For years, I assumed he just facilitated low-level networking introductions for his father. I viewed him as lazy, unmotivated, and content to ride his family coattails. The truth was far more sinister. His consulting agency was an active shell company, acting as a parasitic middleman. My biodefense firm handled highly sensitive logistical frameworks for the government, moving classified biological research materials and securing supply routes. Charles used his political lobbying influence to secure defense contracts, forcing our procurement division to utilize Derek Shell Company as an essential logistics vendor. Once the federal grant money cleared, Derek skimmed vast percentages off the top, fabricating supply costs and inflating administrative fees. They funneled the stolen taxpayer capital directly into the Cayman accounts, dodging federal taxes and laundering the proceeds back into Maryland to fund Victoria designer wardrobe and brook endless allowances. They were committing systemic wire fraud, tax evasion, and direct conspiracy against the United States military. The breath caught in my throat as the supreme irony of the situation washed over me. Charles and Derek believed they were untouchable masterminds. They thought they could execute a petty real estate theft using a forged injunction to corner a helpless daughter-in-law. They were entirely oblivious to the reality that their greed had just handed the blueprint of their treason to a woman whose sole profession involved dismantling financial predators. By attempting to steal my house, they had inadvertently exposed their entire criminal enterprise. The hunter had become the hunted. I saved the unredacted ledgers, the matched vendor files, and the offshore routing codes onto a specialized encrypted drive. The evidence was pristine, forming a flawless chain of custody, proving their guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. The local Annapolis judges Charles bribed could not protect him from this level of prosecution. This required the highest tier of federal intervention. I reached across my desk and picked up my secure landline, a device routed through an untraceable encrypted tunnel. I dialed a specific unlisted number in Washington. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. It was Agent Mitchell. Mitchell was a specialized investigator for the Department of Justice, a seasoned operative I had collaborated with 2 years prior when neutralizing a corrupted supply chain vendor. He operated with quiet, lethal efficiency, despising white-collar criminals who preyed on federal funds. I identified myself and requested a secure data link. Mitchell recognized the cold urgency in my tone and immediately authorized the connection. I initiated the file transfer, watching the status bar confirm the upload to the Department of Justice servers. I spoke clearly into the receiver, outlining the exact nature of the fraud. I detailed how Charles manipulated defense contracts and how Derek laundered the stolen grants offshore. I provided the specific statutes they had violated, handing Mitchell a fully weaponized federal indictment wrapped in a digital bow. Mitchell reviewed the incoming files in real time. I heard his chair squeak over the line, followed by a low, impressed whistle. He confirmed the ledger authenticity and assured me a joint task force would be quietly mobilized within the hour. He advised me to maintain my distance and avoid tipping them off. I ended the call, placing the receiver back onto its cradle. The inescapable trap was officially set. The gears of the federal justice system were grinding into motion, and my in-laws were standing right on the tracks. Sitting alone in the dim glow of my office, I let a profound sense of vindication settle over me. The arrogant men who had treated me like a disposable asset were minutes away from appearing on the radar of the most ruthless investigators in the country. But as I continued to parse through the final encrypted emails in the payload, a new, far darker realization began to take shape on the monitor. The financial ledgers explained the stolen money, but the communication logs pointed toward something else entirely. The conflict was about to shift from domestic white-collar crime into a realm of unprecedented global danger, leaving me bracing for a physical confrontation right on my doorstep. I kept Agent Mitchell on the secure line as the final batch of decrypted emails populated my secondary monitor. The financial ledgers had already proven their relentless greed, but the communication logs revealed a darkness I had never anticipated. I read the subject lines tracing the digital threads woven through the hidden Cayman Island servers. They were not discussing profit margins or consulting retainers. The attachments contained highly classified transit schedules. These were the exact logistical blueprints mapping how our firm transported sensitive biological research materials between secured government facilities. I opened a portable document file detailing a supply route for a proprietary pathogen defense protocol. The logistical blueprints did not just show delivery truck routes, they detailed the temperature-controlled transit of experimental pathogens and classified vaccine prototypes developed exclusively for the military. I traced the recipient domains hidden in the blind copy fields. The emails were sent to a foreign corporate rival, a shadow entity flagged by the Pentagon for maintaining deep ties to hostile state intelligence networks. Handing this specific transit data to a foreign power compromised the safety of the entire eastern seaboard. Derek was taking the operational schedules his shell company was trusted to manage and selling them to the highest bidder overseas. He was trading the safety of our national supply chain for offshore deposits. This was no longer a simple case of wire fraud or tax evasion. They were trafficking national security secrets. By distributing classified logistical data to foreign operatives, my husband and father-in-law had crossed into a direct violation of the Espionage Act. Mitchell fell silent on the other end of the line. The seasoned investigator exhaled a long, slow breath, recognizing the profound severity of the breach. The entire scope of the investigation shifted in that single moment. Mitchell informed me that the Department of Justice was quietly elevating the case. They were transitioning from a standard financial inquiry into a full-scale joint counterintelligence task force. The federal machinery was engaging its most lethal gears. While the tactical teams began their silent mobilization in Washington, Charles experienced the first tremor of his impending collapse. The corrupt local judge he relied upon suddenly hit a procedural wall. Federal authorities had quietly placed invisible holds on the court docket, freezing the fraudulent injunction in its tracks. Charles could no longer manipulate the legal system to protect his stolen lifestyle. The sudden loss of control pushed the patriarch into a corner. His political allies stopped returning his phone calls, sensing the toxic shift in the wind. Desperate men always resort to primitive tactics when their sophisticated illusions fail. The sun had long set, casting my neighborhood into a quiet winter chill. I sat in my home office reviewing the evidentiary files when a jarring, heavy pounding struck my reinforced front door. The sound shattered the quiet of my evening, vibrating through the hardwood floors. It was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, punishing strike designed to invoke fear and force compliance. I did not move toward the entryway. I tapped the tablet resting on my desk, pulling up the high-definition security feed from my porch. The infrared camera captured every detail in crisp grayscale. Charles and Derek stood on my welcome mat. Their polished Annapolis socialite facade had deteriorated entirely. Charles wore a heavy wool overcoat, but his tie hung loose and his silver hair was unkempt. Derek paced back and forth, rubbing his bare hands together in the freezing air, looking like a cornered stray animal rather than a proud consultant. He kicked the base of the heavy oak door, his expensive Italian shoes scuffing against the metal weather stripping. He looked pathetic, stripped of the unearned arrogance he wore so easily at the Christmas party. I activated the two-way intercom, pressing the transmission button. My voice echoed from the external speaker, crisp and devoid of any emotion. I asked them to state their business. Charles stepped right up to the camera lens, his face contorted in unchecked rage. He held a thick manila folder, demanding I open the door and sign the quitclaim deed hidden inside. He insisted I drop the eviction notice and surrender the property to him immediately. He claimed the house was the only collateral he had left to secure a private loan, and he needed my signature to save the family name. I watched his breath form white clouds in the frigid air. I refused his demand, stating clearly that the property belonged to my private holding company and the eviction stood. When I denied him, his tone shifted from demanding to dangerous. He leaned closer to the microphone, delivering a calculated string of threats. Charles promised to use his remaining political connections to destroy my professional life. He swore he would have me blacklisted from every federal contracting job in the state, ensuring I would never work in compliance again. He claimed he could ruin my reputation with a single phone call, rendering my degrees and my career worthless. Derek chimed in from the background, stepping into the camera frame. The man I had shared a life with for 4 years revealed the true depths of his treachery. My husband warned me that accidents happen to stubborn people. He suggested that my physical safety was no longer guaranteed if I continued to disrespect his family and block their financial survival. He told me I was nothing without the Williams name and that I would be living in a trash bag by the end of the month if I did not cooperate. They thought they were intimidating a terrified woman hiding behind a locked door. They believed their sheer physical presence and harsh words would override my logic. They did not realize my intercom system was wired directly into a secure cloud server. I watched the digital equalizer on my screen bounce in perfect rhythm with their shouting. Every single extortionate threat, every promise of retaliation, and every subtle hint of physical violence was captured, digitized, and preserved. The software tagged the audio with a verified timestamp and uploaded it through a virtual private network straight to my remote servers. The audio waveforms spiked on my monitor, translating their desperate rage into undeniable forensic evidence. I smiled coldly from the safety of my office, watching them shiver on the porch. They were handing me the final pieces of their criminal prosecution, wrapping their treason in a neat bow of domestic extortion. They thought they were applying pressure, but they were merely digging their own graves deeper into the frozen earth. I saved the audio files, ensuring the encrypted backup cleared the server. The pieces were perfectly aligned for the final phase of their eradication. I just needed to lure them into a public arena where their destruction would be inescapable. Derek's voice distorted through the external speaker, sounding harsh and metallic against the freezing night air. He abandoned all pretense of being the polished consultant who charmed defense contractors at cocktail parties. The infrared camera mounted above my porch captured the wild, frantic energy radiating from his posture. He leaned so close to the lens that the vapor from his breath fogged the glass enclosure. He screamed that I was nothing without the Williams name. He bellowed that the only reason anyone in Maryland high society even looked in my direction was because I had married into his elite family. His face twisted into an ugly snarl as he promised I would be living in a trash bag by the end of the month if I refused to surrender the property deed. I sat in my ergonomic chair, bathed in the pale glow of my dual monitors. I did not tremble. I did not reach for the alarm panel to summon the local police. I smiled a cold, calculated expression that felt entirely foreign on my own face. Every single syllable of his extortionate threat processed through my cloud server, encoding into a pristine digital format. They were digging their own graves with every word they shouted into the winter wind. I waited for him to finish his tirade, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm on the porch. Then I leaned forward and pressed the transmission button. I intentionally softened my voice, injecting a slight tremor into my vocal cords to mimic profound terror. I told them they won. I stated that the psychological pressure was too much and I could no longer endure the legal threats or the social isolation Brooke had engineered. I offered a compromise. I promised to drop the 30-day eviction notice and sign the quitclaim deed transferring the multi-million-dollar estate back into Charles' control. However, I attached one non-negotiable condition. I demanded the transfer take place at their upcoming New Year Eve gala. I justified the request by claiming I wanted public witnesses to ensure they would not renege on their promise to leave me alone once the paperwork was signed. Through the grainy security feed, I watched Charles exchange a triumphant glance with his son. Blinded by their own narcissistic arrogance, they did not pause to question my sudden capitulation. They did not consider the logistical oddity of signing legal real estate transfers during a lavish holiday party. Their egos simply processed the interaction as their rightful victory over a disobedient subordinate. Charles stepped back to the microphone, a smug, self-satisfied grin replacing his earlier desperation. He eagerly agreed to the terms. He told me to wear something appropriate and bring my favorite pen because the Williams family was reclaiming their legacy. They turned their backs on the camera and strutted down the walkway, their posture radiating unearned dominance. I watched their taillights fade down the dark suburban street. The moment they vanished from sight, my fabricated vulnerability evaporated. I extracted the captured audio files from the security interface. The recording was flawless, capturing the precise legal definition of federal extortion. I drafted a brief, encrypted email attaching the audio waveforms and summarizing the threat matrix. I addressed the message directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Tactical Commander, coordinating the Joint Task Force with Agent Mitchell. I tapped the Enter key. The delivery confirmation flashed on my screen within seconds. The federal agents now possessed undeniable proof that my husband and father-in-law were using threats of physical and professional harm to coerce the transfer of a highly valuable asset. It was the final nail in their impending indictment. The days leading up to December 31st transformed into a masterclass in tactical preparation on both sides of the battlefield. The Annapolis rumor mill operated at maximum efficiency, feeding me constant updates regarding the Williams family event. Charles and Victoria decided to pour the very last remnants of their stolen offshore funds into hosting the most lavish, opulent New Year Eve gala the state capitol had ever witnessed. They viewed the party as a critical strategic maneuver. By throwing an extravagant celebration right inside the estate I legally owned, they intended to project supreme financial power to their network of corrupt politicians and defense contractors. Catering trucks lined the long circular driveway of the waterfront mansion every single morning. I tracked the vendor invoices through my localized intelligence software, marveling at their sheer delusion. Victoria hired a renowned string quartet from Baltimore, imported hundreds of white winter roses, and commissioned massive ice sculptures to flank the grand staircase. They were spending tens of thousands of dollars on prime rib and vintage champagne, while the federal government quietly assembled a raiding party to seize every asset they touched. They believed the gala would serve as a public coronation, where they could announce their ultimate triumph over my eviction notice and secure new illicit investors for their defense logistics scam. While Victoria obsessed over silk napkins and seating charts, I finalized the tactical logistics with the Department of Justice. My townhouse became a quiet command center. I held encrypted video conferences with the lead IRS criminal investigation agents, mapping out the precise dimensions of the grand ballroom. We designated the main entrances the catering exits and the private studies as primary choke points. The federal commander required a detailed visual layout to ensure Charles and Derek could not slip through the service doors when the trap finally snapped shut. I provided the architectural blueprints I had acquired during the purchase of the estate, marking the exact location where the patriarch planned to deliver his midnight toast. The meticulous nature of the federal planning provided a stark contrast to the chaotic greed fueling my in-laws. Agent Mitchell assured me the perimeter would be locked down tight. Unmarked surveillance vehicles were already positioned in the affluent neighborhoods surrounding the estate, tracking the movements of Charles and his elite guests. The authorities were treating the gala not as a social event, but as the epicenter of a major counterintelligence sting. Every guest carrying a clearance badge who interacted with Derek Consulting Firm would be scrutinized. The Williams family was throwing a party to celebrate their wealth, unwittingly funding the very venue where their freedom would end. I was scheduled to walk into the lion den alone, unarmed, and surrounded by enemies who actively plotted my ruin, yet I felt no fear. The anxiety that used to plague me during family gatherings was replaced by a clinical detachment. The Williams family thought they were orchestrating my public humiliation. They thought the stroke of midnight would mark the restoration of their hollow dynasty and my permanent banishment from elite society. They were so thoroughly consumed by their own vanity, they failed to notice the shadows lengthening around them. The stage was set, the players were moving into their assigned positions, and the ticking clock was counting down to a climax that would tear their fabricated universe apart. The afternoon sun dipped below the Maryland horizon, casting long dark shadows across the hardwood floors of my townhouse. Silence reigned inside my walls. It was a sharp divergence from the chaotic, catered frenzy consuming my property across town. A crisp knock at my front door broke the stillness. A private courier stood on my porch, holding a sleek matte garment box. I signed the electronic manifest and carried the package into my bedroom, laying it carefully atop the duvet. I lifted the magnetic lid, pulling back layers of crisp tissue paper. Resting inside was the custom midnight black evening gown I had procured specifically for tonight. The garment was not designed for idle socializing. It was constructed from a heavy, structured crepe fabric that draped like liquid shadow. It featured a high neckline and long, tailored sleeves, projecting an aura of impenetrable authority. The hidden seams incorporated reinforced pockets, perfect for concealing my secure communication devices. I brushed my fingers over the dark material. It was armor, crafted for a modern battlefield. Leaving the gown on the bed, I returned to my home office for one final briefing. The encrypted monitor on my desk flickered to life, revealing the stern features of Agent Mitchell alongside the lead tactical commander of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We did not exchange pleasantries. The time for deliberation had passed. I pulled up the digitized architectural blueprints of the Annapolis estate, projecting them onto the shared secure network. The sprawling layout of my property filled the screen. We traced the entry points, prioritizing the immense grand ballroom where the primary festivities were scheduled. I pinpointed the heavy oak front doors, the catering corridors, and the rear terrace exits, mapping a flawless containment grid. We designated the primary extraction targets, assigning specific tactical units to each individual to ensure zero margin for error. Charles, the arrogant architect of their treason, would likely anchor himself near the main podium, basking in the glow of his fabricated wealth. He needed a dedicated squad to neutralize his inevitable blustering defiance. Victoria would hold court near the VIP champagne fountains, projecting her hollow social dominance to the defense contractor wives. She required agents who would not flinch at her theatrical outrage. Derek, my treacherous husband, would roam the floor seeking validation and attempting to secure new illicit partnerships. Brooke, the venomous sister, would circle the perimeter, hunting for fresh gossip to weaponize. Each of them required a dedicated apprehension team to prevent any chance of escape or destruction of evidence. The tactical commander confirmed the deployment logistics. A fleet of unmarked utility vehicles painted in flat, covert tones was currently idling exactly 3 blocks away from the estate, hidden within the winding suburban streets. Dozens of highly trained federal agents sat inside those dark vans, checking their tactical gear and waiting for my designated signal. We established the precise trigger mechanism. At the stroke of midnight, when Charles planned to deliver his triumphant speech, I would execute a localized network override from my phone. The moment the offshore banking ledgers and classified espionage documents hit the ballroom projection screens, the federal perimeter would collapse inward. The agents would breach the property simultaneously, sealing every exit before a single guest could register the intrusion. The commander asked if I was prepared to stand in the epicenter of the raid. I met his digital gaze through the webcam and assured him my resolve was unbreakable. I terminated the connection, letting the monitor fade to black. A grim, satisfying smile touched my lips as I considered the profound dramatic irony unfolding across the city. At this very moment, my in-laws were likely adjusting their silk bow ties and fastening stolen diamond necklaces. They were toasting each other with expensive vintage champagne purchased using laundered taxpayer funds. They genuinely believed they were marching into a glorious coronation. They thought they had successfully extorted a helpless woman into surrendering a multi-million-dollar asset. Their narcissism blinded them to the reality that they were merely polishing the blade of the federal guillotine hovering mere inches above their exposed necks. They were throwing a lavish party to celebrate their own impending incarceration. The sheer delusion required to host a gala on the eve of a federal indictment was staggering to comprehend. The sun vanished entirely, leaving the townhouse shrouded in winter darkness. I walked back into my bedroom and prepared for the execution. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, favoring sharp angles and neutral tones that projected fierce, unyielding focus. I stepped into the midnight black gown, pulling the heavy fabric over my shoulders. The garment hugged my frame, feeling like a second layer of protective skin. I reached behind my back and pulled the long zipper upward. The sharp metallic click of the fastener locking into place echoed in the quiet room. It sounded like a vault sealing shut. Staring into the full-length mirror, I watched the final remnants of the submissive, people-pleasing daughter-in-law fade into obscurity. That frightened, eager-to-please woman no longer existed. She had died the moment that industrial garbage bag hit the Persian rug. The reflection staring back at me belonged to an apex predator standing at the pinnacle of her professional capability. I was a senior director of federal compliance, stepping into the role of an exterminator, ready to execute a long-overdue pest removal. The toxic parasites who had fed on my finances and my emotional well-being were about to be forcefully extracted from the host. I slipped my secure smartphone into the hidden pocket of the gown and walked out of the townhouse. A sleek black luxury sedan idled by the curb, sent by the transportation service I hired for the evening. The driver opened the rear door and I slid into the leather interior. The vehicle glided away from the curb, navigating the dark, winding roads toward the waterfront. Frost clung to the barren branches of the Maryland oak trees passing by my tinted window. The heater blasted warm air into the cabin, but my veins felt filled with ice. I reviewed the parameters of the sting operation one final time, mentally locking every detail into place. As we rounded the final corner, the Annapolis estate came into view. The sprawling property blazed with light, projecting a beacon of artificial wealth into the freezing night sky. Dozens of expensive sports cars and luxury SUVs lined the long, circular driveway, testaments to the corrupt guests invited to witness my supposed downfall. The driver brought the sedan to a smooth halt near the grand stone portico. I stepped out of the vehicle, and my heels struck the pavement with a sharp, definitive crack. The biting winter air whipped against my cheeks, sharpening my senses. I stood on the threshold of my own home, staring at the towering oak doors. The Williams dynasty was dancing inside, oblivious to the storm waiting on their doorstep, and I was ready to walk in and end their charade. The heavy oak doors of the Annapolis estate swung inward, parting like a grand theatrical curtain. I stepped over the threshold, crossing from the freezing winter night into a suffocating atmosphere of manufactured opulence. The grand ballroom, a space I legally owned, was packed, shoulder to shoulder, with the Maryland elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden hue over a sea of custom-tailored tuxedos and shimmering designer gowns. A live jazz band played a smooth, rhythmic melody from the elevated stage in the corner. The air smelled of expensive cedar, heavy floral perfumes, and the distinct metallic tang of unearned arrogance. I paused at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, observing the crowd below. This was not a simple holiday gathering. It was a summit of corruption. I recognized the faces of men and women who treated the federal government like a personal bank account. Near the towering ice sculptures stood a state senator notorious for rubber-stamping Charles and his dubious zoning permits. Beside him, an aerospace executive laughed, holding a plate of prime rib, oblivious that his own company's supply chain was compromised by the very host pouring his drinks. These were the people my in-laws invited to witness my supposed downfall. They were the captive audience Charles assembled to validate his hollow dynasty. My entrance did not go unnoticed. The midnight black tactical evening gown I wore absorbed the chandelier light, rendering me a dark, imposing figure against the pristine white marble. The conversation near the staircase faltered. Heads turned, whispers rippled outward, spreading like a contagion through the sprawling ballroom. Through the shifting crowd, I spotted my mother-in-law. Victoria stood near the VIP champagne fountain, flanked by her sycophantic country club friends. She wore an emerald silk dress that highlighted the $30,000 diamond Rolex ticking on her wrist. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, her fabricated charm dissolved into a mask of pure, calculated hostility. She did not approach me. Instead, she initiated a targeted whisper campaign. She leaned close to the ear of a prominent defense contractor wife, covering her mouth behind a crystal flute. I watched Victoria point a manicured finger directly at me. Her friends turned to stare, their faces contorting into identical expressions of manufactured pity and mocking amusement. They laughed soft, grating sounds that drifted over the smooth jazz music. Victoria was actively poisoning the room, isolating me, ensuring that every guest viewed me as a defeated outcast, begging for scraps at her table. I descended the marble steps, my heels striking the stone with a steady, measured cadence. I did not avert my gaze. I did not shrink from their judgmental stares. I waded into the sea of guests, letting the crowd part around me. The fabric of my gown brushed against the expensive suits of the men who had ignored my professional warnings for years. Before I could reach the center of the room, a familiar figure stepped into my path, blocking my trajectory toward the catering tables. It was Derek. My husband wore a bespoke charcoal tuxedo that fit his frame with flawless precision, projecting the image of a highly successful logistics consultant. He held a crystal glass of aged scotch in his right hand. The smug clinking of ice against the glass echoed softly, marking his approach like a rhythmic countdown. Derek looked me up and down, taking in the severe, uncompromising lines of my dark gown. He sneered his lip, curling into an ugly expression of pure entitlement. He smelled of rich alcohol and expensive cologne, a scent designed to mask the stench of his impending federal indictment. For 4 years, he had played the role of a supportive partner while secretly siphoning my wealth and selling classified data to foreign rivals. He truly believed he held the ultimate upper hand tonight. He thought the audio recordings he provided on my porch the night before were just empty threats thrown into the wind, rather than digital evidence resting on a Department of Justice server. Derek reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out 2 items and held them suspended between us. In his left hand, he presented a folded legal document, printed on heavy stock paper. It was the quitclaim deed, the instrument designed to sever my ownership of the estate and hand the multi-million-dollar property back to his father. In his right hand, he held an ornate silver fountain pen. He leaned close to my ear, his breath warm and thick with liquor. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, assuming the role of a benevolent victor offering a final scrap of mercy to the vanquished. He told me that if I took the pen and signed the document right now, right in the middle of the ballroom, he would graciously allow me to stay for the midnight champagne toast. He promised to let me maintain a shred of dignity for the next hour before I packed my bags and vacated the premises forever. He smiled, a chilling, arrogant expression, insisting this was the best deal I was ever going to get. The sheer audacity of his ultimatum hung in the tense air between us. Surrounding guests subtly shifted their weight, pretending to converse while actively eavesdropping on our interaction. They waited for my inevitable surrender. They expected me to take the pen, sign away my inheritance, and fade quietly into the cold January night. I looked down at the silver pen resting in his palm. It was a heavy, expensive writing instrument, bearing the engraved logo of Charles' lobbying firm. I reached out and took the cold metal cylinder from his grasp. Derek let out a soft, triumphant breath, his shoulders relaxing as he believed the war was finally over. He held the quitclaim deed forward, waiting for my signature. I did not take the paper. I lifted my gaze, meeting his dark, confident eyes. The lingering ghost of the woman who used to love him vanished, leaving behind a clinical executioner. I gripped the silver pen with both hands, placing my thumbs against the center of the metal casing. I applied sharp, sudden torque. The expensive writing instrument was not designed to withstand lateral force. The metal groaned, then snapped with a loud, distinct crack that severed the quiet murmur of the immediate crowd. The internal ink cartridge ruptured instantly under the pressure. I opened my hands, dropping the jagged, ruined pieces. A thick pool of dark, permanent ink splattered directly onto Derek's pristine Italian leather shoes. The dark liquid seeped into the expensive stitching, ruining the bespoke footwear in a matter of seconds. The ink pooled on the polished hardwood floor, creating a stark, messy stain that mirrored the corruption hiding beneath his tailored exterior. Derek gasped, stumbling backward as if I had struck him physically. He stared down at his ruined shoes and then up at my face, his expression fracturing into sheer, unadulterated shock. The smug, confident consultant disappeared, replaced by a terrified man realizing his opponent was not playing by the established rules of high society submission. The surrounding guests let out audible gasps, stepping away from the splash zone to protect their own designer garments. The sharp sound of the breaking pen and the subsequent commotion drew the attention of the entire room. Across the ballroom, standing near the elevated stage, Charles witnessed the entire interaction. The patriarch of the Williams family watched his son humiliate himself in front of the most powerful defense contractors in Maryland. His face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck pulsed against his starched white collar. Charles could not tolerate a public display of defiance in his own rented domain. His fragile ego demanded immediate, unquestionable submission from anyone who dared challenge his authority. He shoved his way through the throng of guests, ignoring their alarmed protests and spilled drinks. He marched directly toward the stage, his eyes locked onto me with unparalleled hostility. He bypassed the jazz musicians climbing the wooden steps with heavy, punishing strides. Charles reached out and snatched the microphone directly from the lead singer's stand. The abrupt movement caused a loud, jarring thump to echo through the towering speakers, silencing the band mid-note. He turned to face the sprawling crowd, gripping the microphone stand with white-knuckled intensity. He decided in that exact second to abandon any remaining pretense of civility. He was going to execute my public humiliation right then and there. He demanded the attention of every single guest in the room, preparing to deliver a speech designed to destroy my reputation and banish me from their world. He stood under the glaring spotlight, his chest heaving with righteous anger, entirely unaware that he was stepping onto his own gallows. The trap was primed, the audience was captive, and the countdown to his federal eradication had officially begun. Charles stood under the glaring spotlight, gripping the microphone stand. The presidential acoustic system amplified his harsh breathing, broadcasting a deceptive vulnerability across the grand ballroom. He cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the Maryland elite. The live jazz band ceased playing. A heavy, expectant hush settled over the sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos. Charles began weaving a pathetic, calculated narrative. He spoke of family legacy, portraying himself as a weary patriarch, burdened by an ungrateful and toxic presence. He claimed his son had endured years of emotional manipulation at my hands, painting a picture of a patient family pushed to the brink by a ruthless gold digger. To protect their heritage, Charles announced Derek was officially filing for divorce and stripping me of all access to the Williams estate. The crowd reacted on cue. Gasps rippled through the opulent room. Wives of defense contractors covered their mouths, casting looks of manufactured pity in my direction. They whispered behind their crystal champagne flutes, thrilling at the scandal of a discarded spouse being publicly exiled. The politicians Charles regularly lobbied nodded in solemn agreement, validating his hollow performance. They expected me to crumble, to weep, or to flee the room in profound shame. They anticipated a broken woman surrendering to the crushing weight of their high society judgment. I did not run. I did not shed a single tear. I smoothed the heavy structured fabric of my midnight black tactical gown and walked forward. My posture projected predatory calm. The guests parted before me, their mocking murmurs fading as they registered the icy, unyielding focus in my eyes. I navigated the polished marble floor with deliberate, measured strides. I bypassed Derek, who stood frozen near his ruined Italian shoes, staring at me with a dawning sense of dread. I headed straight for the bandstand. Charles watched my approach, his smug expression faltering. He expected a frantic, hysterical woman begging for a second chance. Instead, he saw a seasoned federal compliance director executing a flawless takedown. I climbed the wooden steps of the stage, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing over the murmurs. He tried to pull the microphone back, stepping away from my trajectory, but his reflexes were dulled by age and unearned arrogance. I reached out and ripped the cold metal cylinder directly from his trembling grip. A sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback tore through the ballroom. The sudden, punishing sound forced several guests to cover their ears, wincing in genuine pain. The jazz musicians behind me scrambled away from their instruments, leaving their brass horns resting on the stage floor. Charles stumbled backward, his face draining of color as he realized he no longer controlled the narrative. He opened his mouth to shout for security, but fear paralyzed his vocal cords. I stood at the center of the stage overlooking the captive audience. I retrieved my secure smartphone from the hidden pocket of my gown. With a single tap on the illuminated screen, I initiated the localized network override. High above the dance floor, towering projection screens had been displaying a digital countdown to the new year, surrounded by glittering animations of falling snow. In an instant, the festive graphics vanished. The screens flashed a stark, sterile white, plunging the ballroom into a harsh, clinical glare. The unredacted forged power of attorney materialized on the displays. The document loomed 20 feet high, showcasing the fraudulent signature and the corrupt notary stamp for every politician and executive in the room to scrutinize. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the vast space, carrying a lethal, unwavering authority. Charles Williams just told you he is protecting his family estate, I announced, the acoustics driving my words into every corner of the room. But Charles does not own this property. He is a delinquent tenant facing a formal eviction. To prevent his removal, his son forged my signature on the legal document currently projected above your heads. Murmurs of confusion swept through the elite crowd. A prominent real estate developer near the front row squinted at the screen, his jaw dropping as he recognized the illegality of the paperwork. I did not give them time to process the real estate fraud. I tapped my phone again. The screen shifted, replacing the forged deed with a complex matrix of offshore banking ledgers, the Cayman Island routing numbers highlighted in stark crimson text. The Williams family projected an image of generational wealth. I continued translating the dense financial data into plain, inescapable English. In reality, they are broke. They fund their country club memberships by skimming federal grants. The ledgers you see now trace millions of taxpayer dollars stolen from Maryland biodefense contracts funneled directly into hidden overseas accounts. I pointed a finger toward Derek. He stared up at the screens from the ballroom floor, his face a mask of pure terror. He looked like a man watching his own execution broadcast live. The guests surrounding him instinctively took a step back, treating him like a sudden contagion. I initiated the final payload. The banking ledgers vanished, replaced by the decrypted espionage emails. Classified logistical blueprints detailing the transit of sensitive military pathogens illuminated the room. The complex diagrams showcased temperature-controlled transport routes for experimental vaccines developed exclusively for the Department of Defense. Many of you in this room hold high-level security clearances, I said, making direct eye contact with an aerospace chief executive who had ignored my compliance warnings last quarter. You understand exactly what these schematics represent. But simple fraud was not enough for them, I declared, my tone dropping into a chilling register. Derek used his consulting firm to intercept highly classified supply routes. He sold this operational data to foreign corporate rivals linked to hostile state intelligence networks. I paused, letting the undeniable proof burn into their retinas. The Williams family are not wealthy socialites, I stated, the final verdict ringing clear. They are domestic terrorists actively compromising the national security of the United States. The silence that followed was total and terrifying. Then the realization hit. The defense contractors, politicians, and biotechnology executives understood they were standing in a room hosted by active traitors. Being photographed at this gala could end their lucrative careers and invite relentless federal scrutiny into their own lives. Maryland relies heavily on government contracts, and nobody wanted to lose their livelihood over a fraudulent lobbyist. Sheer panic erupted. Guests shoved each other aside, abandoning their crystal glasses and spilling expensive wine on the imported rugs. They were desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive epicenter of the Williams dynasty. The stampede of expensive leather shoes against marble echoed like thunder. Men in tuxedos trampled over fallen floral centerpieces. Women abandoned their silk shawls, frantic to reach the coat check and the exit doors. Brooke stood frozen near an ice sculpture, her smartphone dangling uselessly from her fingers. The sister-in-law, who had dedicated her week to destroying my reputation, was now permanently silenced by her own family treason. Victoria shrieked, clutching her designer handbag as the crowd surged past her. Charles gripped his chest, gasping for air as his fabricated universe burned to ash around him. The chaos escalated beyond all control, but the true reckoning had not yet breached the walls. Charles lunged toward the audiovisual cart positioned near the edge of the bandstand. His polished leather shoes slipped slightly on the slick wooden floor of the stage. He was panting, a desperate wheezing sound escaping his lungs as he clawed at the thick bundle of black cables powering the projection system. He thought if he could just sever the power cord, he could plunge the room into darkness and somehow undo the devastating revelations burning on the screens above. His frantic fingers grazed the heavy rubber insulation of the primary plug. Before he could exert enough force to pull the cable, the grand entrance of the Annapolis estate ruptured. The towering, heavy oak doors of the ballroom did not merely open, they exploded inward with earth-shattering force. The sheer kinetic impact of the breach sent a shockwave through the humid air of the gala. The chaotic stampede of terrified socialites and defense contractors halted, instantly frozen by the overwhelming display of federal power. The lingering echoes of panic were entirely drowned out by the deafening, synchronized slam of heavy tactical boots striking the polished marble floors. Dozens of federal agents flooded the opulent space, moving with swift, uncompromising precision. They wore dark tactical armor and sturdy windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The stark, utilitarian presence of the strike force created a jarring visual contrast against the sea of shimmering silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The agents did not shout unnecessary orders or fire warning shots. Their silent, coordinated efficiency was far more terrifying than any cinematic display of force. They rapidly established an immediate, impenetrable perimeter, sealing every exit, archway, terrace door, and service hallway. Nobody was leaving the premises. The net was cast, and the targets were trapped inside the very cage they had funded with stolen taxpayer dollars. Across the room, standing near the abandoned ice sculptures, Victoria witnessed the invasion. For decades, my mother-in-law had curated an existence built entirely on fabricated superiority. She viewed anyone outside her exclusive country club circle as disposable peasants meant to serve her whims. Now her pristine illusions were shattering under the weight of federal authority. A horrified, guttural shriek tore from her throat, rising above the low din of the stunned crowd. Her fingers went limp. The crystal champagne flute she had been clutching slipped from her grasp. The delicate glass plummeted toward the hard marble surface. It shattered on impact, sending sharp, glittering fragments and expensive vintage alcohol spraying across the floor. The breaking crystal sounded like a final gavel strike condemning her hollow dynasty. From the center of the tactical formation, the lead federal agent emerged. It was Agent Mitchell, the seasoned investigator I had briefed earlier that evening. He moved with a relentless, predatory stride, keeping his sharp eyes locked onto the stage. He marched up the wooden steps, bypassing me without a single glance. Our lack of interaction was a calculated maneuver, demonstrating that I was not a participant in their criminal enterprise, but rather the architect of their downfall. Charles abandoned the projector cables and spun around, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to project political dominance. He puffed out his chest, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion, invoking the names of state senators and powerful judges he believed he still owned. Agent Mitchell did not entertain the blustering lobbyist. He did not issue a verbal warning or read Miranda rights from a script. He closed the distance in 3 rapid strides, grabbing Charles by the lapels of his expensive custom suit. Using a swift, forceful motion, Mitchell swept the older man off his feet and slammed him face first onto the smooth, polished lid of the grand piano resting on the stage. The impact produced a loud, discordant crash of musical notes echoing bizarrely through the silent ballroom. Charles let out a breathless whimper, his cheek pressed hard against the cold, black lacquer of the instrument. Mitchell pinned the patriarch between his heavy tactical vest and the piano, pulling the lobbyist's arms sharply behind his back. The harsh, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs biting into Charles' wrists echoed over the sound system. Charles Williams Mitchell announced, his voice projecting across the ballroom with chilling clarity. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, severe embezzlement of government funds, and direct violations of the Espionage Act. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you start exercising it right now." Down on the ballroom floor, the reality of a life sentence finally pierced Derek's unearned arrogance. My husband had spent his entire life taking the path of least resistance, using my career and his family connections as a shield against consequences. With his father pinned to a piano and his offshore bank accounts exposed on the projection screens, Derek's survival instincts kicked in. He did not stay to fight or defend his mother. He turned on his heels and ran. Derek sprinted toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, hoping to disappear into the service corridors and slip away into the dark winter night. He scrambled across the marble, his ruined, ink-stained Italian shoes losing traction on the spilled champagne and discarded floral arrangements. He did not make it 10 yards. 2 armed federal agents stationed near the catering exit anticipated the cowardly flight. They intercepted his path, moving with fluid, lethal synchronization. One agent lowered his shoulder, delivering a ruthless, punishing tackle that lifted Derek entirely off the ground. My husband crashed hard onto the marble floor, sliding a few feet before coming to a halt. His bespoke charcoal tuxedo tore at the seams, the expensive fabric ruined by the unforgiving stone. The agents swarmed him, pressing their knees firmly into his spine, pinning him to the floor. Derek thrashed for a brief second before the cold steel cuffs locked his wrists together, rendering him a helpless prisoner in front of his former elite peers. While the men of the family were physically subdued, the women faced a different kind of execution. Brooke, the venomous 28-year-old sister who had spent the week orchestrating my social demise, stood paralyzed near the center of the room. She had never worked a legitimate day in her life, funding her designer wardrobe and luxury vacations entirely through her father's stolen defense grants. 2 stern agents from the Internal Revenue Service approached her, holding thick stacks of legal documents on heavy clipboards. They did not touch her. They simply handed her a stack of federal warrants outlining the immediate seizure of her checking accounts, trust funds, and luxury vehicles. The agents informed Brooke that every asset tied to her Social Security number was officially frozen as proceeds of a federal crime. The realization that her entire identity was a crime scene broke her. Brooke collapsed into a hysterical, sobbing heap right there on the ballroom floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, wailing uncontrollably, her designer makeup running down her face in dark, pathetic streaks. She begged the agents to reconsider, claiming she knew nothing about the overseas accounts. But her cries fell on deaf ears. The investigators simply stepped around her weeping form, moving to secure the rest of the property. The Maryland elite, the defense contractors, politicians, and aerospace executives backed away from the Williams family, treating them like highly radioactive waste. The same people who had laughed at my expense and eagerly consumed Charles' expensive catering now scrambled to put as much physical distance between themselves and the traitors as possible. They huddled near the edges of the room, their eyes wide with horror, witnessing the swift, uncompromising brutality of the American justice system. I stood alone on the bandstand, untouched by the chaos swirling below. The tactical gown felt like a suit of armor, shielding me from the collateral damage of their eradication. I looked down at the ruined dynasty. Charles was weeping silently against the grand piano. Derek was pinned to the floor, panting like a captured animal. Brooke was a puddle of misery, and Victoria stood shivering in the corner, stripped of her false royalty. The physical breach was complete, the arrests were executed, but the true punishment was just beginning. The federal government was about to unleash an administrative nightmare that would guarantee they never saw a single dime of their stolen wealth again, and I was ready to watch them lose everything. The grand ballroom transformed into a site of swift administrative execution. The kinetic energy of the tactical breach settled into a terrifying procedural rhythm. Agents and dark windbreakers moved with clinical precision, shifting their focus from physical containment to fiscal eradication. The immediate aftermath felt like watching a majestic ship sink beneath freezing waters, pulling every shred of the Williams family entitlement down into the dark abyss. Brooke remained crumpled on the polished stone floor. A female investigator stood over her, reading from a thick stack of certified warrants. The agent systematically outlined the total freeze of Brooke checking accounts, trust funds, and luxury vehicle leases. Every country club membership, every premium credit line, and every offshore account tied to her Social Security number was officially seized by the federal government. The 28-year-old woman wept, her sobs echoing off the vaulted ceiling, mourning the sudden death of her elite socialite identity. She possessed no real skills, no legitimate work history, and now no stolen capital to fund her delusions. She tapped her phone screen frantically, trying to access her banking apps, only to find stark red error messages blocking her out. A few yards away, near the catered buffet, Victoria leaned heavily against an ice sculpture table. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. The matriarch watched the federal investigators cataloging the expensive artwork and catering equipment. Her emerald silk dress shimmered under the chandelier, but her posture had collapsed into a hollow shell. She darted her eyes left and right, noticing an agent approaching her flank with a clipboard. Survival instincts honed by years of deceptive social climbing briefly overtook her sheer terror. Victoria slowly unclasped the $30,000 diamond-encrusted Rolex from her wrist. She attempted a frantic sleight of hand, sliding the heavy timepiece down her arm and reaching for her designer purse, resting on a nearby cocktail table. She hoped to secure at least one tangible piece of wealth to pawn later, a final lifeline to her evaporating fortune. Her attempt was painfully amateur. A stern Internal Revenue Service investigator intercepted her motion, stepping directly into her personal space. He did not yell, but his tone carried an unyielding authority. He demanded she hand over the watch. Victoria sputtered, clutching the diamonds against her chest, claiming it was a cherished family heirloom. The investigator shook his head, producing a printed ledger from his clipboard. He read aloud the exact date of purchase and the corresponding fraudulent Cayman Island wire transfer used to buy the timepiece just 2 years ago. Without another word, he reached forward and uncurled her trembling fingers. He stripped the glittering watch from her grasp, sealing it inside a clear plastic evidence bag. He coldly informed her that the item was officially classified as proceeds of a federal crime. Victoria watched her crown jewel drop into the plastic pouch, her face twisting into a silent scream of pure agony. The ultimate symbol of her hollow dynasty was gone, replaced by the grim reality of imminent poverty. I stepped down from the bandstand, the heavy fabric of my midnight black tactical gown brushing the marble stairs. The chaos of the room parted for me. I walked toward the center of the dance floor where Derek lay pinned. The agents had pulled him into a seated position against a marble pillar, his arms locked securely behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. His bespoke charcoal tuxedo was torn at the shoulder, stained with spilled champagne and the dark ink from the shattered fountain pen. He looked up as my shadow fell over him. The unearned arrogance that had defined our entire marriage had vanished. Tears streamed down his bruised face, leaving streaks through the dust clinging to his cheeks. The man who had mocked my career, siphoned my inheritance, and sold classified intelligence to foreign rivals, now looked at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. "Amanda, please," Derek choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of his impending incarceration. He leaned forward, struggling against the restraints. "You have to help me. Tell them to stop. We are married. We took vows. You cannot just stand there and watch them take me away." His plea echoed the same manipulative tactics he had used during the freezing highway drive. He tried to weaponize our marital bond, hoping a lingering fragment of my former submissive nature would rush to his rescue. He wanted me to use my compliance credentials to negotiate a lenient deal, still believing he could extract value from my professional standing. I stopped 2 feet in front of him. I did not offer a sympathetic gaze. I crouched down, bringing my face level with his, balancing effortlessly in my heels. The ambient noise of the raid faded into the background. I leaned in close, ensuring my words were meant for him alone. My voice dropped into a freezing whisper, stripped of any residual warmth. "You should have read our prenuptial agreement much closer, Derek," I stated, watching his eyes widen in fresh confusion. Section 4, Paragraph 2, it contains a strict felony nullification clause. In the event either party is convicted of a federal crime, the marriage is instantly voided and the offending party forfeits all claims to joint assets, spousal support, and shared property. He blinked rapidly, processing the harsh legal reality. I was not just leaving him, I was erasing his access to my life with surgical precision. "You get nothing," I continued, enunciating every syllable. "You are going to a federal penitentiary with zero capital, and just to ensure your sentence is as long as possible, I am personally pressing domestic charges for the forged power of attorney you slid under my door. I hope Charles enjoys his cell next to yours." Derek opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The realization that I had anticipated his treachery years in advance broke his spirit. He dropped his head, sobbing into the collar of his ruined shirt, a broken traitor facing decades in a concrete box. I stood up, turning my back on his weeping form. I surveyed the grand ballroom. The elite guests, the defense contractors, and the Maryland politicians remained huddled near the edges of the room, watching in stunned silence. They had attended this gala expecting to witness the public execution of my character. Instead, they watched a toxic dynasty eradicated in under 10 minutes. An aerospace chief executive wiped a nervous bead of sweat from his forehead. The state senator who had rubber-stamped Charles' zoning permits looked physically ill, calculating his own exposure to the imminent scandal. The country club wives who had eagerly participated in Brooke gossip campaign now turned their backs on the weeping women, severing all social ties in real time. They understood the implicit warning. The woman standing in the center of the room was not prey. She was an apex predator who commanded federal authority to cleanse her domain. Agent Mitchell walked past the catering doors, having finalized the secure transport of Charles. The seasoned investigator paused near the stage, catching my eye. He did not offer a cheerful smile or a boastful remark. He simply gave me a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of our joint operation. The federal commander recognized a fellow guardian of the law. I returned the nod, a silent pact of justice served. The heavy lifting was done, the traitors were in custody. Now I just had to wait for the dust to settle to claim my ultimate reward. 6 months slipped by with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a turning tide. The American justice system, notorious for its grinding pace, moved with unprecedented velocity when dealing with the theft of national security secrets. The federal task force meticulously dismantled the Williams dynasty, leaving no stone unturned and no hidden account untouched. The grand jury indictments dropped like a succession of heavy gavels. Charles and Derek faced a staggering mountain of irrefutable evidence. The decrypted emails, the offshore routing numbers, and the recorded extortion attempts formed a legal labyrinth with no possible exit. Facing the crushing weight of the Espionage Act, their high-priced defense attorneys abandoned them the moment the retainer funds were frozen by the courts. They were assigned overworked public defenders and quickly advised to plead guilty to avoid a life sentence. Today, my former husband and father-in-law reside in a maximum security federal penitentiary located deep within the Appalachian Mountains. The men who once obsessed over Italian leather shoes and bespoke charcoal tuxedos now wear standard-issue bright orange jumpsuits. They sleep on thin mattresses, resting on concrete slabs entirely stripped of their unearned arrogance. The presiding judge showed zero leniency, handing down a minimum sentence of 20 years without the possibility of early parole. They will age behind reinforced steel bars, their political connections rendered utterly useless. The elite defense contractors they used to lobby scrubbed their names from every corporate registry, acting as if the Williams family never existed. Just yesterday, the morning mail delivery brought a stark reminder of their new reality. Mixed among the pristine corporate briefs sitting on my desk was a wrinkled envelope stamped with the insignia of the Federal Corrections System. The return address bore Derek Inmate Identification Number. I sliced the paper open with a silver letter opener, reading the frantic scribbled handwriting. The man who once threatened to leave me homeless was now begging for commissary money, complaining about the quality of the prison food and pleading for a few dollars to buy instant coffee. I did not feel a single pang of sympathy. I did not even finish reading the second page. I walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder resting in the corner of my home office. I fed the letter directly into the spinning steel blades, listening to the satisfying mechanical grind as his desperate words were reduced to illegible confetti. While the men rot in a concrete box, the women of the family face a different kind of grueling punishment. The Internal Revenue Service Asset Forfeiture Division thoroughly eradicated Victoria and Brooke's stolen wealth. They lost the country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, and the designer wardrobes purchased with laundered government grants. With their bank accounts drained and their social standing annihilated, they were forced to flee the affluent borders of Annapolis. They relocated to a cramped, moldy two-bedroom apartment situated in a neglected industrial outskirt of Baltimore. Brooke, a woman who spent her entire adult life mocking working-class citizens, now stands behind a cash register at a discount retail store. She spends her days standing under harsh fluorescent lights, folding clearance rack sweaters for minimum wage. Her manicured hands are now rough and blistered, her feet aching in cheap canvas shoes. Victoria endures a similar fate, working as a part-time receptionist at a local dry cleaner. The high society friends they used to gossip with blocked their phone numbers, treating them like a contagious disease. They are invisible ghosts haunting the perimeter of a world that discarded them the moment their checkbooks bounced. Their current misery traces back to the poetic justice delivered on the very night of the federal raid. After the agents processed the arrests and secured the primary evidence, the remaining family members were ordered to vacate the premises immediately. Victoria wept on the marble floor, shivering in her emerald silk dress, demanding a set of designer luggage to pack her personal toiletries. I walked into the kitchen and opened the pantry door. I pulled a single item from the bottom shelf and carried it back into the grand ballroom. I dropped a heavy black industrial trash bag right at Victoria's feet. It was the exact same brand of garbage sack Charles had thrown at me during the Christmas gift exchange. I looked down at my shivering mother-in-law and told her she had 5 minutes to fill it before the federal marshals escorted her off my property. The look of profound humiliation that washed over her face as she gathered her designer shoes into the crinkled plastic remains burned into my memory, setting a flawless victory into stone. She shuffled out the front doors, dragging her ruined life in a disposable sack. Now standing on the sprawling terrace of my Annapolis estate, I inhale the crisp, salty breeze blowing off the Chesapeake Bay. The lingering stench of their arrogance is entirely erased from these walls. I hired a team of interior designers to strip away the pretentious decor, replacing it with clean, modern elegance that reflects authentic success. The echoing silence of the halls brings me immense peace. My home is a sanctuary, fortifying my spirit rather than draining it. My career trajectory mirrored the ascent of my personal freedom. Recognizing my instrumental role in neutralizing a severe vulnerability within the defense supply chain, the board of directors promoted me. I now serve as the Vice President of Federal Compliance, wielding authority over compliance protocols across the entire Eastern Seaboard. I command a dedicated team of forensic auditors hunting down the very predators who try to mimic Charles and Derek. My days are filled with purpose, my intellect valued, and my independence secured. I hold a crystal flute of expensive champagne, the cool glass resting comfortably in my palm. The setting sun paints the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold, casting a warm glow over the quiet waters. The ripples on the bay catch the fading light, sparkling with undeniable promise. I take a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the sharp, crisp taste of absolute autonomy. I raise my glass toward the empty, quiet house, acknowledging the brutal journey that brought me to this exact vantage point. They tried to hand me a garbage bag for Christmas, expecting me to bow my head and accept the disrespect. Instead, I found my spine, forged my armor, and successfully took out the trash. My home is finally clean. Never let anyone dictate your worth or weaponize your loyalty. When toxic individuals show you their true nature, do not shrink into the shadows. Gather your evidence, secure your boundaries, and let their own arrogance engineer their downfall. True power does not roar or demand attention in a crowded ballroom. True power observes plans and strikes when the enemy feels untouchable. The Williams family learned that lesson far too late. The Chesapeake Bay breeze carries a distinct winter chill tonight, whispering through the ancient oak trees lining the edge of my property. I trace the smooth rim of my crystal flute, watching the distant harbor lights flicker against the dark rolling water. The silence of this sprawling estate offers a profound canvas for reflection. It has been over a year since the federal authorities dismantled the hollow dynasty that once occupied these halls. While the legal files are closed and the prison sentences are actively being served, a lingering question remains anchored firmly in my mind. How does an entire family reach such a catastrophic point of moral decay? When I look back at the wreckage of my marriage and the spectacular downfall of my former in-laws, I do not merely see a tale of white-collar crime or corporate espionage. I see a tragic, agonizing masterclass in parental failure. The demise of Charles and Victoria was not a sudden accident. It was the inevitable harvest of the seeds they planted decades ago in the minds of their children. Derek and Brooke were not born federal felons or entitled socialites. They were meticulously molded into those specific roles by parents who fundamentally misunderstood the vital assignment of raising human beings. In the pursuit of the quintessential American dream, we are often told that the highest form of family responsibility is to provide a better life for our offspring. We tend to measure this success in tangible, shallow metrics: a prestigious zip code, a pristine luxury timepiece, a membership at a gated country club, and a circular driveway filled with imported European sedans. Charles and Victoria subscribed to this superficial religion with terrifying devotion. They constructed a traditional family structure that looked flawless on a glossy holiday card, but functioned as a vacuum of authentic character. They equated material provision with parental guidance, completely bypassing the arduous, uncomfortable work of building a solid moral compass. Honesty and fairness are not traits a child inherently possesses at birth. They are psychological muscles that must be exercised daily through careful observation and gentle, consistent correction. Within the walls of the Williams household, those crucial muscles were allowed to atrophy. Whenever Derek encountered a minor obstacle during his formative school years, Charles simply bribed a teacher, called in a political favor, or manipulated the circumstances to ensure his son never felt the sting of a legitimate consequence. They taught him that rules were merely suggestions designed to control the lower classes. They shielded him from accountability, genuinely believing they were protecting his boundless potential. The sheer lack of emotional awareness in their child-rearing strategy was staggering. Victoria raised Brooke to believe that a woman's value was tethered exclusively to her proximity to power and the expensive labels sewn inside her garments. Empathy was viewed as a liability, a character flaw that impeded ruthless social climbing. When you raise a child in an environment where human interaction is strictly transactional, you inevitably create adults who view other people as disposable utilities. That is precisely why Derek could look me in the eye and recite sacred wedding vows while secretly planning to siphon my financial identity. He did not see a life partner. He saw a limitless credit line because his parents taught him that taking whatever you desire is the ultimate privilege of the elite class. We frequently discuss the concept of generational wealth in this country, analyzing trust funds and expansive real estate portfolios. Rarely do we pause to examine the concept of generational trauma disguised as extreme privilege. The most devastating thing a mother or father can do is hand their child the keys to an empire without first teaching them the heavy, solemn burden of stewardship. If you provide the reward without demanding the requisite effort, you do not raise a leader, you groom a parasite. This brings me to a perspective that modern society rarely wants to acknowledge. We are heavily conditioned to believe that a parent's most sacred duty is to shield their children from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the outside world. We eagerly applaud the mother who fights every single battle for her daughter, and the father who leverages his formidable influence to erase his son's mistakes. But this protective instinct is fundamentally flawed. Shielding a child from the natural consequences of their own actions is not an act of unconditional love. It is the ultimate form of parental betrayal. By insulating Derek from failure, Charles robbed his son of the vital opportunity to develop a rigid spine. He padded every single fall so thoroughly that when the federal justice system finally delivered a legitimate blow, my husband shattered like cheap, untempered glass. If Charles had allowed his son to fail a college exam to lose a minor entry-level job, or to face the severe embarrassment of a bounced check 2 decades ago, Derek might be sitting in his own living room tonight instead of pacing a maximum security cell. True parental devotion requires the agonizing discipline of stepping back and allowing your child to scrape their knees on the rough pavement of reality. It requires the emotional fortitude to watch them struggle, knowing the pain of today forged the necessary armor of tomorrow. Our culture needs a desperate, sweeping recalibration of what it actually means to be a successful family unit. The dinner table must return to being a sanctuary of truth, rather than a theatrical stage for curated perfection. We must teach the next generation that true power does not reside in the brand of a watch or the exclusivity of a charity guest list. True power is the quiet, unshakable integrity of knowing your actions align perfectly with your core principles, even when absolutely no one is watching. It is the emotional intelligence to recognize the inherent dignity in every individual, regardless of their checking account balance. The Williams family handed me a black industrial garbage bag during a Christmas gift exchange because they lacked the fundamental human decency to treat a relative with basic respect. They thought it was a brilliant, triumphant display of social dominance. They failed to realize that the trash bag was the exact legacy they had already passed down to their own offspring. They wrapped their children in thin, hollow arrogance and tossed them into a complex world they were entirely unequipped to navigate. If you have ever witnessed the devastating ripple effects of toxic parenting, or if you are actively working to break a cycle of generational narcissism in your own life, let me know your deepest thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Told Stories for more narratives that dive deep into the messy complexities of human nature and the quiet justice we all eventually face. As I watch the harbor lights slowly extinguish in the distance, swallowed by the creeping midnight fog, I realize that the most terrifying villains in our lives rarely wear obvious masks. They wear tailored suits and hand down poison values across the breakfast table over cereal and orange juice. We spend our entire lives building massive stone fortresses to keep the monsters out, never realizing that sometimes the true danger is the beloved architect teaching us how to lay the bricks. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that we are broken by our families, but that we eventually mistake those shattered fragments for a flawless masterpiece.